Have you ever wondered how a single act of kindness could change a stranger's life forever? Why are you feeding scraps to that ragged boy? The man at the next table scoffed, his voice sharp enough for the whole diner to hear. Sarah simply smiled, set the plate on the counter near the door, and turned away without a single word. The next morning, the quiet Texas town froze in disbelief as 6 black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of Ruby's Cafe, their engines humming in the crisp autumn air. Who was that quiet boy in the oversized jacket? And why had a 4-star general come in person to thank a small-town waitress no one had ever noticed before? Sarah Mitchell, 31, lived in a small, no-frills apartment above the local laundromat on Main Street. The walls were thin, the floorboards creaked, and the radiator hissed in the winter. But to Sarah, it was home. She had moved there 6 years ago, right after her mother passed away from heart failure. The apartment was supposed to be temporary, just until she got back on her feet. But as the months turned into years, Sarah found herself still there, a quiet figure in a quiet town. Her mother, Diane, had been her anchor, warm, steady, and practical. Diane had worked double shifts as a nurse to keep them afloat after Sarah's father walked out when she was only 4. Growing up, Sarah had never asked many questions about why he left. It was one of those wounds her mother carried silently, a scar that never quite faded. Diane poured everything into her daughter, teaching her the value of hard work, kindness, and resilience. When Diane fell ill, Sarah was only 25. She took on 2 jobs, caring for her mother during the day and working the night shift at Ruby's Cafe. Even as her mother's health failed, Diane's biggest worry wasn't her own suffering. It was Sarah's future. When Diane passed, the apartment above the laundromat became Sarah's retreat, her safe corner of the world. But it was also a place of deep loneliness. The only constant companion in Sarah's life became Max, a scruffy, aging golden retriever she adopted from a shelter 3 years ago. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a lifeline. On the hardest nights, when the weight of an empty home and long shifts at the diner pressed down on her chest, Max was there, resting his head on her lap as if to remind her she wasn't as alone as she felt. Sarah's days became a steady rhythm of work and quiet solitude. She was known around town as the reliable one, the waitress who always showed up on time, always remembered your order, always wore a gentle smile. But few people knew the loneliness she carried. The truth is, many people in small American towns, especially the older generation, understand that kind of quiet grief. Loss becomes a thread woven into the fabric of life. Whether it's the loss of parents, spouses, friends, or even dreams that never had a chance to bloom. For Sarah, small acts of kindness became her way of keeping connection alive. A refill of coffee without being asked, an extra slice of pie left at a table, a sandwich placed on a bench for a hungry child. And in those moments, she discovered something that surprised even her. Sometimes the smallest gestures were the ones that carried the most weight for both the giver and the receiver. Tommy appeared one chilly evening in late September, like a shadow at the edge of Sarah's world. She first noticed him near the back of Ruby's Cafe, huddled close to the dumpsters in the parking lot, half hidden behind a stack of old milk crates. He couldn't have been more than 9, his thin frame swallowed by a jacket at least 3 sizes too big, the sleeves dangling past his fingers. His dark hair was messy, his cheeks smudged with dirt, and his eyes, the weary, watched the world with a quiet intensity far beyond his years. At first, Sarah thought she was imagining things. She caught a glimpse of him as she took out the trash. But when she looked again, he was gone. The next night, he was there again, watching from the shadows. He never approached, never spoke, never made a sound. Sarah felt a tug in her chest, an ache she hadn't expected. She knew that kind of hunger, not just for food, but for safety, for warmth, for someone to notice you. That evening, Sarah did something small but deliberate. As she cleared the last table, she packed a sandwich and some fries into a takeout container and set it near the back door just inside the alley. She walked away without looking back. When she returned a few minutes later, the box was gone. From then on, the ritual unfolded. Every night, Sarah didn't need to look to know Tommy was there. The faint shift of a shadow, the whisper of movement was enough. Each night she left something, a grilled cheese sandwich, leftover pie, or sometimes just a warm biscuit wrapped in a napkin. And each morning the empty container waited by the dumpster, carefully set aside as if in thanks. Over time, Tommy grew bolder. He stopped hiding by the dumpsters and started sitting on the wooden bench near the edge of the lot. Still, he never crossed the threshold of the cafe. He never spoke, never waved, never begged. He simply waited, small and silent, eyes trained on the back door. Sarah never tried to force a conversation. She understood instinctively that trust had to be earned slowly, gently. So, she offered what she could: food, a nod of recognition, and the grace of leaving the boy's dignity intact. It's easy to overlook children like Tommy, the invisible ones. In every town, every neighborhood, there are kids drifting through the margins. Kids who slip through the cracks without anyone noticing. Who sees them? Who stops to care? For Sarah, that question became impossible to ignore. And though she didn't have much to give, she gave what she could, night after night. Because sometimes the smallest gesture can remind a child that they are not invisible, that they matter. It was a Thursday evening when Richard Evans walked into Ruby's cafe. His polished black shoes clicked sharply on the old checkered floor. His tailored navy suit, a sharp contrast to the worn booths and simple charm of the small-town diner. Richard wasn't a local. His sleek BMW was parked just down the street at the auto shop for repairs, and he had wandered in looking for a quick meal. Sarah could feel his eyes on her as she moved between tables, balancing plates of pot roast and steaming cups of coffee. She kept her smile polite, her movements efficient as always. At the back of her mind, she was aware of Tommy sitting on the bench outside waiting as he always did. Tonight, she had packed him a turkey sandwich and a small bag of chips. As she walked toward the back door to leave it by its usual spot, Richard's voice cut through the soft din of the diner. Giving scraps to that ragged boy, he sneered loudly, his voice carrying easily across the small room. Giving garbage to garbage. The words hit the air like a slap, and the cafe seemed to momentarily freeze. A young couple at the next table shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman in the corner lowered her coffee cup and glanced away. Even the clatter of forks and knives paused for a beat. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, the sting of embarrassment blooming in her chest. But she didn't stop. She simply placed the container near the door, gave a small nod toward the bench outside, and turned back inside without a word. As she crossed the room, her heart was hammering, but her face stayed calm. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was stronger than argument. But Mike Reynolds, the owner of Ruby's Cafe for nearly 4 decades, wasn't about to let it slide. From behind the counter, where he'd been drying glasses with a faded dish towel, Mike moved with quiet purpose toward Richard's table. "Coffee refill, sir?" Mike asked pleasantly, though his voice held a subtle edge. Richard gave a dismissive wave. "Sure, and maybe tell your waitress to save her charity for someone who matters. Kids like that are just leeches on society." Mike's hands moved steadily, pouring coffee into Richard's cup with practiced ease. Then he looked the man directly in the eye and said softly but firmly, "Everyone matters in my diner, sir. We don't pick and choose who deserves kindness here." Richard froze, his smirk faltering for a moment. Around him, the other diners watched quietly. No one spoke, but the weight of their attention hung in the air. Richard coughed awkwardly, stirred his coffee, and dropped his gaze to his plate. The tension eased. The quiet murmur of conversation slowly returned, and Sarah resumed her work, her heart a little lighter. It's easy to imagine that courage always comes with shouting, with fists on tables or raised voices. But the truth is, courage often whispers. It's the quiet voice that says enough when cruelty creeps into everyday life. It's the steady hands that keep pouring coffee while standing up for what's right. That night, Sarah learned again what she had always known deep down. You don't need to fight every battle with words. Sometimes just doing the right thing calmly, quietly speaks louder than anger ever could. And in a world full of noise, that kind of quiet bravery matters more than we often realize. That Thursday night, as Sarah finished wiping down the counters and turned off the neon open sign, she noticed something unusual near the back door. Resting on the corner of the wooden bench where she always left Tommy's meals was a small folded scrap of paper pinned down by a smooth round stone. Sarah picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the crumpled page. Written in shaky, uneven pencil strokes were the words, "Dad said, if someone is kind to you, tell his friend." For a long moment, Sarah just stood there, the paper fluttering slightly in her hand. It was the first message Tommy had ever left, the first sign that the silent exchange they had built over weeks meant something deeper to him. She felt a tightness in her throat, a wave of unexpected emotion welling up. The words were simple, almost childlike, but they carried the weight of something larger, something Sarah couldn't fully understand yet. That night, Sarah lay awake in her small apartment above the laundromat. Max, her old golden retriever, snored softly at her feet, but Sarah's mind refused to quiet. She turned the note over and over in her hands, reading the line again and again. Who was Tommy's father? Where was he now? Why did Tommy wander alone in the cold night, relying on scraps from a diner? For the first time, Sarah wondered if the sandwiches and fries were enough. Was she really helping, or was she just easing her own conscience? She thought about going to the police or contacting child services, but something in her heart hesitated. Tommy was wary, skittish. Any sudden interference might drive him away for good. Still, the questions gnawed at her. Did he have a place to sleep? Did he have anyone looking out for him besides her? And what if something happened to him on one of those cold Texas nights outside her window? The quiet town slept under a blanket of stars, the streets empty except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But in Sarah's chest, a storm of doubt and worry raged. It's a hard truth that so many people wrestle with. When is kindness enough? Giving a meal, offering a warm coat, handing over a few dollars at a stoplight. These are small mercies, but sometimes they barely scratch the surface of someone's need. When does an act of charity become a lifeline? And when does it become a bandage over a wound that needs real healing? By morning, Sarah was no closer to an answer. But one thing was clear. Her connection to Tommy had changed. It was no longer just about sandwiches and leftovers. She felt responsible now, not just for his hunger, but for the quiet message he had trusted her with. She promised herself that when he came back, if he came back, she would find a way to do more. That morning, as Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee before her shift, she tucked the note carefully into her wallet. It stayed there, a quiet reminder pressed between faded receipts and crumpled bills, whispering to her in the quiet moments, kindness matters, but sometimes kindness must be the beginning, not the end. The next morning, just as the golden light of Texas dawn settled over the quiet town, Ruby's Cafe was already stirring with its usual rhythm. Sarah had come in early, still restless from the night before, pouring coffee for the regulars and trying to focus on her tasks. But a hum of sound outside made her glance up, the low, steady rumble of engines, too synchronized, too deliberate to be ordinary traffic. Through the large front window, she saw them, 6 black SUVs pulling up to the curb. Their polished surfaces dusted from the rural roads, their presence unmistakably official. Conversation in the cafe fell away, forks hovered midair. Even the old jukebox seemed to quiet its usual morning soundtrack, fading into a hush of anticipation. The doors of the lead vehicle opened, and a tall man in uniform stepped out, his bearing crisp and unmistakably military. The sunlight caught the polished stars on his shoulders, 4 of them gleaming against his olive-green jacket. His face was lined but resolute, his silver haircut in precise military fashion. As he entered Ruby's Cafe, the small bell above the door gave a soft, almost delicate chime, a sound far too ordinary for the moment unfolding. Sarah froze behind the counter, her hand resting on the coffee pot. The general's eyes swept the room with quiet authority before they landed on her. With careful, measured steps, he approached. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sir." The general gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "I'm General Charles Montgomery," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Tommy's grandfather." For a second, Sarah struggled to process the words, grandfather. She had assumed, if she had assumed anything, that Tommy had no one. But now, standing before her was a man whose presence filled the room, not just with rank, but with something heavier, grief. "My grandson lost his mother a month ago to cancer," General Montgomery explained quietly, his voice softening. "His father, my son, was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago." We've been trying to help Tommy through his grief, but. His eyes briefly flicked away, gathering himself. Sometimes children withdraw into places we can't easily reach. Sarah felt a sudden rush of understanding, the pieces falling together. The oversized military jacket, the cautious silence, the desperate need for a safe harbor. He trusted you, the general continued, his voice catching ever so slightly. You were the first person he let in. Around them, the cafe remained hushed, the usual clatter of plates and coffee cups replaced by a kind of reverent stillness. Even the regulars, men and women who had known Sarah for years, looked on with quiet awe. Sarah felt her eyes sting as she glanced toward the door, half expecting to see Tommy's small frame just outside waiting. Families of military service members carry wounds that don't always show, the kind no medal or folded flag can heal. Behind the discipline, the folded uniforms, and the ceremonial salutes are empty chairs at dinner tables, birthdays missed, and children like Tommy who carry burdens far too heavy for their small shoulders. In that moment, Sarah realized that her quiet acts of kindness had bridged a gap that uniforms and authority couldn't cross. She hadn't just fed a hungry boy. She had offered him dignity, a reminder that he wasn't invisible. The general reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled drawing, a child's rendering of a woman handing food to a boy in an oversized coat. At the bottom in shaky handwriting were the words, "Dad's friend who helps me." Sarah felt the lump rise in her throat again, the full weight of what this small connection had meant to Tommy. The general placed a gentle hand on the counter. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave my grandson something we couldn't. You gave him back a sense of safety." And as Sarah stood there, the quiet hum of Ruby's cafe returned. But the place would never quite be the same again. General Charles Montgomery stood at the counter, his polished boots planted firmly on the checkered floor of Ruby's cafe. In his hands, he held a folded child's drawing, Tommy's drawing. As he carefully opened it, the room seemed to draw in a collective breath. The picture was simple, done in crayon on lined paper. A woman with a kind face handing food to a small boy in an oversized jacket. Beneath it in shaky letters were the words, "Dad's friend who helps me." Sarah stared at the paper, her chest tightening. She had no idea that her quiet, wordless acts had reached Tommy in such a deep, lasting way. The general's voice softened as he spoke. "This is what Tommy gave me 3 days ago," he said, glancing around the hushed cafe. "For weeks, we struggled to reach him. He wouldn't speak to his counselors. He pulled away from family. But then you became his anchor." Sarah swallowed, her heart emotion rising in her throat. She barely noticed as one of the general's aides stepped forward, carrying a dark leather case. With deliberate care, the general opened it, revealing a gleaming medallion on a blue ribbon, the Civilian Service Medal. "This," the general continued, "is rarely awarded to civilians. But in our eyes, you went above and beyond the call of ordinary kindness. You saw a child in need, and you gave without question, without judgment. You reminded a grieving boy that compassion still exists in the world." Sarah's eyes filled, her hands trembling slightly as the general gently placed the medal in her palm. Around her, the cafe had gone utterly still. Mike Reynolds, the cafe owner, stood quietly near the kitchen, his arms folded across his chest, a rare softness in his usually gruff expression. Linda, his wife, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Even the regulars, the ranchers, the truck drivers, the elderly couples, looked on with reverence. Then the door chimed softly, all heads turned as Tommy stepped hesitantly into the cafe. He was freshly washed, his hair combed, wearing a clean jacket. His wide brown eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Sarah, a tiny, shy smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. For the first time, Tommy's voice broke the silence. "Hi, Miss Sarah." It was a whisper, barely there, but to Sarah it rang louder than any medal, any speech, any honor. She crouched down, her eyes level with his. "Hi, Tommy," she said softly, her voice thick with feeling. In that moment, Sarah understood something profound. Honor doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it stands behind a counter pouring coffee and handing out sandwiches. Sometimes it is found in the smallest, quietest gestures, the ones no one expects and no one demands. As applause broke out in the cafe, tentative at first then swelling, Sarah realized her life had quietly changed. And though she never asked for recognition, that day became a reminder for everyone present that heroism often looks like ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because it's the right thing to do. In the weeks that followed, Ruby's Cafe became more than just a little diner on Main Street. It became a symbol of quiet transformation. The first change came in the form of the menu. Right below the breakfast specials and the house chile, a new item appeared, written in careful script on the chalkboard. Tommy's sandwich, turkey and cheese on whole wheat, extra pickles. It was the very same sandwich Sarah had been leaving for Tommy on those cold nights. At first, Sarah hesitated when Mike suggested adding it. I worried it would draw too much attention to the boy. But Tommy himself smiled when he saw his name on the board, and that settled it. Tommy's recovery was slow but steady. No longer lingering outside in the cold, he now came into the cafe on weekends, slipping into a corner booth by the window. Sometimes he would bring a book. Sometimes he just watched the world go by. Sarah always made sure his chocolate milk never ran dry, and Max, her old golden retriever, became a regular visitor, curling up under Tommy's feet. The boy, who had once been a silent shadow in the parking lot, was finding his voice little by little, one quiet day at a time. The townspeople noticed, too. Regulars who had once turned a blind eye to the boy now greeted him by name. They asked how he was doing, gave him gentle smiles, and even left small treats for him at the counter. A packet of crayons, a toy car, a slice of pie. What was once just an ordinary cafe became something else, a reminder of what a small town can do when it chooses compassion over indifference. The transformation wasn't just about Tommy, though. Ruby's Cafe began attracting new visitors, people who had heard the story and wanted to sit where kindness had unfolded. Veterans came by, touched by the military connection. Young parents came, eager to show their children what a community's heart could look like. Sarah, for her part, remained humble. She worked her shifts with the same steady grace, pouring coffee, refilling salt shakers, and sharing quiet laughs with the regulars. But something inside her had softened and deepened. She no longer saw her work as small or insignificant. She had learned firsthand that a sandwich was never just a sandwich, and a gesture of kindness could ripple far beyond what she could imagine. In small towns across America, stories like Tommy's remind us that true change doesn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping policies. Sometimes it comes from the strength of a close-knit community, from ordinary people choosing to see and care for those who might otherwise be invisible. Ruby's Cafe became a place where that truth lived on, written not just on the menu board, but in the hearts of everyone who walked through its door. Sarah never imagined that a quiet life working at Ruby's Cafe would one day lead her into rooms filled with military leaders, psychologists, and social workers. But in the months following Tommy's story, her name began to circulate beyond their small Texas town. Word spread about the waitress who had made a difference, not through money or power, but through simple, consistent kindness. One day, Sarah received a phone call that would shift the course of her life yet again. A National Military Family Support Foundation had heard about what she'd done and wanted her to serve on their advisory board. The board included military officials, mental health experts, and nonprofit leaders, people tasked with developing policies and programs to support veterans' families, especially children, like Tommy. Sarah's first instinct was to say, "No, I'm just a waitress," she thought. What could I possibly offer them? But the foundation persisted, assuring her that they wanted real voices from the community, people who understood what it meant to care at the ground level. Hesitant but curious, Sarah agreed to attend her first meeting. She walked into a large conference room feeling entirely out of place, sitting between uniformed generals and doctors with degrees on the wall. Yet, when the discussion turned to outreach programs, Sarah found her voice. She spoke about trust, about how kids like Tommy don't open up to official forms or scripted outreach, but to people who show up consistently without fanfare or judgment. She explained how in small towns, kindness travels by word of mouth, and how little gestures, a meal, a smile, a steady presence can change lives. The board listened. More than that, they began to shift their thinking. Some programs were redesigned to include local cafe owners, school staff, and volunteers in their strategies. Sarah even helped pilot a training program to teach community members how to notice and respond to quiet signs of struggle among military families. Back home, Sarah remained as grounded as ever. She still worked her shifts at Ruby's, still greeted regulars with a smile, still brought Max, her golden retriever, to visit Tommy on weekends. But something inside her had changed. She no longer saw herself as just a waitress. She understood deeply that ordinary people can help shape extraordinary change. That policymaking isn't reserved for people in suits or with advanced degrees. Sarah's work became a symbol of how communities can come together and how even those without titles or authority can shape better futures. In a world that often separates experts from everyday people, Sarah reminded everyone that sometimes the best solutions come from those who live with their feet firmly on the ground, with their hearts open, and with their eyes trained on the small human details that truly matter. As we close this story, we're reminded that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we walk past every day. The waitress with the kind smile, the quiet child on the bench, the neighbor who checks in when no one else does. Sarah's simple act of leaving a sandwich wasn't just about feeding a hungry boy. It was about restoring his faith in people, in community, and in compassion. In today's fast-paced world, especially here in America, where individualism often takes center stage, it's easy to overlook the small, quiet ways we can make a difference. We're busy, we're distracted, and sometimes we assume that only big actions matter. But Sarah's story, brought to you by Valor Stories, reminds us that everyday kindness can change the course of someone's life and that no one is ever too small, too ordinary, or too late to make an impact. For our older viewers, many of whom have seen decades of change in their communities, this story invites reflection. Who were the people in your life who showed you quiet kindness? And today, who might be waiting for a gesture from you? A neighbor, a grandchild, a stranger? We'd love to hear from you. Please share in the comments what small act of kindness has stayed with you or what gesture are you inspired to make after hearing Sarah's story. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you were touched by this story, please like this video, subscribe to our Valor Stories channel, and share it with someone you care about. Together, let's keep these powerful conversations alive because kindness, no matter how small, is something the world can always use more of.